Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Pedestrian Focus webinar, sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety and the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center. Today's webinar is entitled Pedestrian Safety and Accessibility Considerations at Modern Roundabouts, and we'll be speaking with Dr. Bastian Schroeder of the Institute for Research and Education at North Carolina State University, and Dr. Isebrands of the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center's Safety and Design Technical Services team. My name is Dan Jolene. I'm the Program Manager for the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Attendees, if you can hear me and you can hear our speakers, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hand, just so we can be sure that you can hear us. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that so we can get some feedback from you all. All right, we see some hands going up. That's good. Glad you could all join us today. Excellent. All right, well, thank you very much. Now, before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to introduce Tamara Redman of the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety, who will be giving a brief overview of the Office of Safety's proven safety countermeasures. And Tamara, go ahead and take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm Tamara Redman. I'm the Pedestrian Safety Program Manager for Federal Highway Safety Office. And this webinar is part of Federal Highway's Focus States and Cities initiative that has been going on for 7 years. And we've been doing these webinars as a way to provide information of interest to our focus states and cities, but we have since opened it up to others as well about 2 years ago. And this webinar is a series that we're doing. Federal Highway's Office of Safety in January announced a list of 9 countermeasures that we're promoting as proven to improve safety overall. And they're in 3 different areas. If you look at the slide on your screen, intersections, pedestrians, and roadway departure are our 3 areas that we're focusing on. And the first three countermeasures, roundabouts, corridor access management, and back plates with retroreflective borders, fall under the intersections. But roundabouts are an issue for pedestrians, and particularly visually impaired pedestrians. So that's why we decided to do this webinar topic today. In the last webinar that we had, we talked about pedestrian hybrid beacon, and in the coming webinars we'll talk about road diet and medians and pedestrian crossing islands in urban and suburban areas. And those are the 3 that we're focusing on as part of the pedestrian countermeasure initiative. As I mentioned, we also focus on roadway departure. So the 3 countermeasures that we are promoting that have to do with roadway departure are longitudinal rumble strips and stripes on 2-lane roads, enhanced delineation and friction for horizontal curves, and safety edge. And the other focus area leaders will also be having webinars in the future on their relevant countermeasures. I guess, Dan, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamara. Now, before we continue with today's webinar, I just want to go over a few administrative details about the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program, and you should be able to rejoin the session. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on the call, and so by muting your audio, it helps us cut down on the confusion and background noise. Now, as an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrows. And though you won't be able to speak, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box. Now, if you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here, and I'll monitor these questions and concerns. I'll respond if I'm able to. And questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program, when we've built in about 25 to 30 minutes for a discussion period. And please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Also, when you exit the webinar today, there will be a very brief survey that will pop up, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on our performance. Following the webinar today, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will be sent 1 or 2 days after the presentation and will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to the other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their name. Now, this webinar has been submitted to the AICP and may be approved for 1.5 CM credits. The Road Safety Academy, which is the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. And for more information on future webinars that we're offering or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit www.walkinginfo.org/webinars. And in addition to these webinars, CVIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at www.walkinginfo.org/training. And now, while Bastian is getting set up with his slide presentation, I just want to take a quick poll from the audience to see if you all can tell us a little bit more about who is attending at your site. So take a few minutes and respond to this poll. Okay, we'll give it a few more minutes so everyone has a chance to respond. Okay, great. All right, thank you for your feedback there. We've got one more poll for you now, and this one is a little more closely related to some of the topics we're going to be talking about today. So we're want you all to tell us a little bit more about your community's current approach toward constructing roundabouts. Select all of these that apply to your community. Some have single-lane roundabouts or multi-lane roundabouts. Some are considering constructing them but may not have them yet. And some don't have plans to construct roundabouts. So we're interested in learning a little more about how we can, how you all are addressing roundabouts in your communities. Okay, thanks. I'll give you a few more minutes to respond to this one, and then we'll move on to one more poll question. It looks like about 2/3 of you, almost more than 2/3 of you, currently have single-lane roundabouts. So that's very interesting to see your perspective on this. And then another, more than half, also have plans to construct roundabouts as well. So, okay, great. Thank you very much. We're going to close this poll for now. We've got one more we'd like to get your feedback on. Okay. And now this one has a little bit more to do about what the barriers are to roundabout implementation. What's keeping you from constructing roundabouts, if anything? You can check all of the options that apply here. I'll give you a few more minutes. Okay. Now it looks like about half of you are concerned about the safety of pedestrians when installing, and that's good to know. And then almost 2/3 are lacking the adequate right-of-way. About 40% of you are concerned about cost and also the unfamiliarity with design. And then about 40% also have concerns over the accessibility for visually impaired pedestrians. So thank you very much for providing that feedback. It's very useful to us as presenters. I'll now be turning it over to Bastian Schroeder to begin today's webinar. So Bastian, as soon as you're ready, please take control of the screen and begin your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And assume that everybody can hear me at this point.
Yep, you sound good. Thanks, Bastian.
Okay,
right ahead.
Thank you very much. In the first part of our presentation today, we will focus on the accessibility concern at roundabouts, especially as they're related to pedestrians who are blind. And what I'd like to do in the presentation is I'd like to first give a general overview of the accessibility challenges we see at roundabouts, briefly talk about the U.S. Access Board position, at least in my understanding, then talk about NCHP Report 674, which is available for download on the TRB website, and I will provide that web link also, and then talk a little bit about other accessibility research as it relates to roundabouts. So first of all, I want to make sure that everybody on the call is familiar with the type of roundabout design that we're talking about. We're looking at a circular shaped intersection with yield control at entry and geometric design features that generally promote a low speed environment. And so there's geometric curvature at the entry and exit points or mostly at the entry points of the roundabout that control the speeds. The yield sign at entry in a counterclockwise circulation, and these roundabouts can have multiple lanes, and in fact that's where a lot of the challenges come from. Here's some images of other round intersections. On the left is a large traffic circle or rotary, this one in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Very large in-scrap diameter, much larger than the modern roundabouts that we're talking about, and also therefore resulting in much higher speeds. The opposite example on the right is a traffic calming circle, this one in Austin, Texas, which doesn't have all the same design features as a modern roundabout. And I just wanted to be sure that we're not talking about these categories yet. They clearly have their own challenges and opportunities for accessibility, but they're outside of the scope of our presentation here today. In terms of the accessibility challenges to somebody who is blind at a multi-lane or a single-lane roundabout, we like to distinguish the crossing task for a blind pedestrian into 4 different components. The first one is that of actually finding the crosswalk. As somebody who's walking with a cane is trailing, for example, a grass strip as is shown on the top right picture, they would be able to follow that grass strip around and it would guide them to the particular crosswalk location. The next challenge then is aligning to cross, which if the approach to the crossing is perpendicular, that is an easier task, but a lot of times we have skewed crossings where it's very difficult for somebody who cannot see to realize what orientation they have to align on. The focus of most of the research on roundabouts is on the third point, which is deciding when it is safe to cross in the form of either a large gap or of a yielding vehicle or multiple yielding vehicles in the case of a multi-lane roundabout. And then finally, maintaining alignment during crossing, which is maybe more of a challenge at very large signalized intersection with 6 or 8 lanes of crossing, but it can also be a challenge at busy roundabouts, especially if some of the skewed approaches that is shown in the bottom picture. Some of the confounding challenges that make roundabouts so difficult to cross for somebody who is blind is that traffic flow in general is uninterrupted because there's no traffic signal, there's no predetermined stop and go patterns, and depending on the design of the roundabout you can be faced with potentially high vehicular speeds. There's typically also high ambient noise at the roundabout crosswalk being generated by traffic in the circulating lane that, while not directly conflicting with the crosswalk traffic, may generate noise that may make the audible identification of gaps and yields very challenging. One of the biggest challenges is the non-straight geometry and sometimes a lack of understanding of what the roundabout geometry in fact looks like, and that having a difficult time listening to traffic patterns and really understanding where traffic is coming from and where it's going. And then one of the real challenges that we see at many roundabouts in the United States is a general low driver yield compliance. That yield compliance is anecdotally at least much higher in other countries, but so that complicates the situation. Thankfully, there are some treatments available, and I will throughout the presentation talk about what some of these treatments are. The position of the U.S. Access Board. The Access Board has currently issued a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Accessible Public Rights-of-Way, which is available from the Access Board website at the link provided. This document has gone through extensive public comments in the first draft, second draft, and most recently in a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that is where the comment period for that one closed early this year. It is expected that that document will eventually move forward to a final rule and then be adopted as a formal standard. But even in the absence of that final rulemaking, as I understand it, there is very strong guidance that the language contained in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is the current best practice in terms of accessible design of public rights-of-way. There's two factors that really are critically linked to the accessibility of a modern roundabout. And the first one is the wayfinding challenge, which there's a requirement that the pedestrian crossing is easily located for wayfinding. And as I've mentioned in an earlier picture and also shown in this picture, is that the ability to trail a grass planting strip or maybe an urban fence that then would have a break and a clear indication of where the crosswalk is located, that is a requirement in these guidelines. Related to that and not listed on the slide is the requirement to delineate the pavement, the edge in the transition between the sidewalk and the crosswalk by detectable warning surfaces that are tactile and detectable by somebody who's blind. The issue of probably the biggest controversy is a requirement for two-lane approaches, and this is two-lane entries or two-lane exit as a roundabout, to have some sort of a signalization treatment, an accessible pedestrian signal. There is a provision in the guidance that will allow a pedestrian hybrid beacon, formerly known as a hawk signal, to take the place of a standard push-button activated pedestrian signal, but the requirement is there. The Access Board allows for what they call equivalent facilitation, which means that if an agency can demonstrate that there is an alternative treatment that provides similar levels of accessibility, that also meets the public rights-of-way accessibility guidelines. However, there's no clear guidance provided on how that equivalent facilitation would be determined. I want to emphasize that the Access Board guidelines only apply to roundabouts where pedestrian facilities are provided. And so on the screen now are a few examples of interchange roundabouts or rural roundabouts that don't have pedestrian facilities at all. And these are in no way impacted by the language in the U.S. Access Board. So a lot of the also multi-lane roundabouts in the United States that are at interchanges or in rural locations, as the one in Kansas shown in the middle of the screen, if no pedestrian facilities are provided at all, there's also no need for making them accessible. I would now like to turn to NCHRP Report 674, which is published on the TRB website, and the web link is shown at the bottom of your screen. This report emerged out of NCHRP Project 3-78 and has now been published as this report. There are also print copies available, but the PDF online is free download. What is shown on the screen is an outline of that report. It provides some introduction and literature review on the accessibility challenge at both roundabouts and intersections with channelized turn lanes for pedestrians with disabilities. And then there's a lot of detail on the research methodology, the study methodology for evaluating these types of locations in an experimental setup, and also an analysis framework which includes the definition of performance measures for accessibility. And while I don't have a lot of time in this presentation to go into the details there, I encourage you to go to that resource and investigate what you can find there. I will spend more time on Section 5, the results, and some of the performance measures that we actually collected in field installations at roundabouts, including some treatment testing. The report also gives some abilities for extension of the study results in the form of actually some delay models that agencies can use to estimate the delay of a roundabout, the delay of pedestrians at both single-lane, multi-lane roundabouts and intersectional channelized turn lanes. And there's also a fair bit of discussion on the use of microsimulation tools to further evaluate pedestrian performance. Then Chapter 7 is a bit of a conclusion chapter where there's a lot of detail on interpreting the results and what the findings mean to an agency and to other stakeholders. And then finally, there are detailed appendices which are also available for free download that have a lot of detail on the performance measures collected and on the study design. And I encourage you to also take a look at those. Overall, the objective of NCHRP Report 674 is to establish a common language and performance measures for this ongoing accessibility debate. It is, at this point, not in a position where it can give warrants or specific requirements for treatment installation, but it does contain a fair amount of data, 12 empirical studies at 5 different intersections with the help of 56 blind participants and over 3,000 crossing attempts that have been evaluated and scored on accessibility performance. It does provide an initial assessment of these new crossing treatments, particularly for the two-lane roundabouts, and I will go into more detail on what those are. Then the extension through modeling and simulation, and maybe most importantly a baseline for future research in this area, and I'll talk a little bit about one of what some of the ongoing research issues are, that we encourage compatibility with this report in an effort that future results can be pooled into an overall database and come to some solution in these accessibility questions. In terms of the study results, I will not go into details of the channelized turn lanes, although we did look at 2 approaches with different treatments installed. I encourage you to go to the report there and get the detail. I will talk about single-lane roundabouts where we evaluated 3 different sites, however without treatments. We evaluated 2 of the sites in only a one-time precondition, and then the 3rd site actually in a before and after type study, but without treatment installation. And we did that to test for a learning effect to see if the same participants exposed to a roundabout repeatedly would have an increase in crossing performance. In a 2-lane roundabout, we did look at 2 different approaches in a pre- and post-treatment evaluation design and tested both a pedestrian hybrid beacon, formerly known as a hawk signal, and a raised crosswalk. All of these studies involved blind participants and blind study volunteers who were accompanied by a certified orientation and mobility specialist who received some basic orientation and training on what the roundabout operations are like, but then made all their crossing decisions independently. They were always supervised so that when they made a decision that was potentially dangerous, that the orientation mobility specialist would intervene, which then the rate of intervention becomes a key safety measure. Obviously, the higher the rate of interventions, the more dangerous, the more risky a crossing environment is. These are aerial shots of the 3 roundabouts that we tested. They were in 3 different cities in multiple states in the U.S. Again, we didn't test any treatments, but we had a good range of varying geometries, ranging from some very tight roundabouts with an in-scrap diameter of 88 feet, which is in the bottom left, to some much larger roundabouts with a diameter on the order of 100 or 120 feet. We also looked at a range of traffic volumes, including some with very heavy peak hour traffic and others in a more residential area, such as the top left, with relatively low traffic volumes. And so we were able to study very different participants in terms of different cities and also different local driving cultures. Overall, our results showed that single-lane roundabouts appear to not pose unreasonable crossing difficulties to most of the blind participants. Provided that, however, there are low speeds at the roundabout through good design, that there is a driver culture that's generally courteous and will yield to the pedestrian, that detectable warning surfaces and other wayfinding treatments are installed to guide somebody who is blind to the crosswalk, and that there's some level of orientation and mobility instruction specific to roundabout crossings to give some general training on what type of traffic patterns to look for. While this is the general conclusion of Report 674, it should also be caveated by the fact that at least one of the sites had a relatively high intervention rate of close to 4% of crossings that resulted in an intervention. And interestingly, that was the lowest speed, tightest radius design, but also the site with the highest traffic volume. Another site had very high delay, an 85th percentile delay of 35 seconds per lane of crossing, and so that will result in about 70 seconds of delay to actually cross both the entry and the exit lane. Interestingly, that was one of the wider diameter roundabouts with very low traffic volume, where the crossing strategy for a lot of the participants ended up waiting until an all-quiet period or a large gap was presented to them. Let me now turn to the 2-lane roundabout, and this is the one that was studied in the intersection of Golden Road and Johnson Road in Golden, Colorado. And we used the same roundabout to test 2 different treatments. At the top crosswalk here, or the northern crosswalk, we installed a pedestrian hybrid beacon, and then at the southern crosswalk, we installed a raised crosswalk or speed table. Both of these crosswalks are very similar in geometry, very similar in traffic volumes, and so we felt it was a very good comparison. And we randomized all of our trials where some of our participants started at the pedestrian hybrid beacon while others started at the raised crosswalk to not introduce any bias. What's shown on this slide now is an image of the raised crosswalk tested at the southern leg. This was a 3-inch vertical elevation, and there's an image shown of an SUV driving over the raised crosswalk. It had some advanced markings to indicate that the pavement was raised, but in general it didn't result in a very severe speed impact to drivers. We saw a reduction in speed, but it wasn't uncomfortable driving across this particular location. At the other approach, we tested a pedestrian hybrid beacon, which is shown on the screen now. And for those not familiar with the pedestrian hybrid beacon, it's a signal that rests in dark for vehicles. Upon activation of the pedestrian, it then goes into a flashing yellow sequence and then steady yellow sequence. It then presents a dual steady red, which coincides with the pedestrian walk phase. And then during the pedestrian flashing dawn walk, the drivers are presented with an alternating flashing red, which allows them to proceed with caution, provided that the pedestrian has cleared the crosswalk. In terms of the results, we found that the raised crosswalk reduced both the average and 85th percentile delay quite significantly. And maybe most importantly, it reduced the rate of O&M interventions from 2.8% to 0%. We did observe some, in quotes, risky events that looked like a potential for a multiple threat situation. However, they didn't result in a measurable intervention. The pedestrian hybrid beacon performance, interestingly, was very, very similar. In all of the three measures shown here, the average delay, the 85th percentile delay, and also the O&M interventions. So we found that both of these treatments proved highly effective at the tested roundabout. One of the concerns of the pedestrian hybrid beacon was a relatively high rate of vehicle red light running violations, which is defined as the number of vehicles observed during the steady red phase who proceeded through the crosswalk without stopping, which was 12.6%. And this causes some concern, and this is also a finding that was mirrored in the second pedestrian hybrid beacon study I will talk about shortly. Overall, the study found that two-lane roundabouts were challenging without additional treatments, related to the fact that typically speeds and volumes are higher, that multiple threat situation exists with a near lane yielding vehicle blocking information both auditorily and visually of an approaching vehicle in the far lane. But the treatments, both tested treatment, proved quite effective in reducing speeds, increasing yields, and promoting crossing opportunities, which then resulted in a reduced delay and risk as measured by interventions. There was one additional study, two additional roundabouts that were evaluated related to a lawsuit litigation in Oakland County, Michigan. There's also a final report which is available at the web link shown at the bottom of your screen. These were two roundabouts with 2 or 3 approach lanes, and they were tested with a rectangular rapid flashing beacon system, RRFB, and also with a pedestrian hybrid beacon. Here's an image of the pedestrian hybrid beacon as installed at a 3-lane entry approach at the roundabout of Maple and Drake Road in West Bloomfield Township in Michigan. Here's a picture of the rectangular rapid flash beacon, which was a side-mounted system of pedestrian warning, and the light bar in between the two signs is where the flashing beacon is, which has an alternating yellow flashing pattern once the pedestrian activates the system. What's shown on the slide now are the results from the pedestrian hybrid beacon and the rectangular rapid flash beacon. And maybe the biggest thing to draw attention to is that the at this other roundabout, including the 2-lane and the 3-lane approach, the pedestrian hybrid beacon quite successfully reduced interventions from 6.4% to 0.9% at the 2-lane approach, and from 11% to 0.4% at the 3-lane approach. The results of the rectangular rapid flash beacon were mixed. At the 2-lane entry, we found a reduction of estimated interventions, and the term estimated refers to the fact that the participants didn't actually cross the roadway at this location, but merely indicated when they would have crossed normally. A reduction from 7.5% in the before condition to 0%, a quite drastic reduction. However, for the 2-lane exit as well as entry and exit lane at the 3-lane approach, significant risk remained even after the installation of the treatment, leading the team to conclude that this is not a satisfactory treatment, at least at the tested intersection. However, due to some promise of the RFB treatment at the two-lane approach and also in the lower volume environments, FHWA is currently sponsoring research to further explore RFBs at multi-lane roundabouts in the U.S. And I believe Hillary will talk a little bit more about that study in the next presentation, where the research team will investigate 8 RFB approaches to really explore some alternatives at multi-lane roundabouts, alternatives to the pedestrian hybrid beacon or to signalization. The study is expected to be completed in 2014 with a lot of data collection in Oregon and Washington happening in just a few months here. And there's some additional research, additional sites needed. I believe Hillary will also talk about that in terms of identifying other test locations. There's also an ongoing effort by ITRE in the form of a task force on accessible roundabouts that is looking at providing some additional guidance. In closing thoughts, the Access Board Notice of Proposed Rulemaking received extensive comments, which are currently being reviewed by the Access Board and will likely require some time before any further decisions are made. In the absence of that rulemaking, it is believed that while the treatment alternatives proved effective, there's more research needed to solidify the results. There are 2 data points now for the pedestrian hybrid beacon, but only 1 data point each for the RFB and the race crosswalk. I'm hoping that the national accessibility debate in webinars like this one here and other ones that we have done previously will really generate some momentum as is already evident, and there's already a lot of municipalities moving forward with treatment installation. And I hope that more research will happen in these areas that will then emphasize the compatibility with the 674 framework to eventually be able to pool all these results and provide guidance to the Access Board as well as agencies on how to really promote accessible roundabouts. So in my last 3 slides, I have some examples of roundabouts that I consider to be pretty well accessible. The first one is a very small roundabout in Raleigh, North Carolina, relatively low speeds, 1-lane crossing, landscaping strip, and separation between the sidewalk and the circulating lane through planting. It does need to have detectable warnings installed, which are actually installed at this point, just not at the time this picture was taken. Here's another example of an existing roundabout signal at a relatively low-speed multi-lane roundabout in Gatineau, Canada, with a zigzag configuration. This is now not a pedestrian hybrid beacon, but this is a standard pedestrian signal. It also needs detectable warning, but it also has very nice delineation of landscaping and really directing the pedestrian to the crossing points, which should facilitate with wayfinding and alignment. And then finally, as an alternative, this is an aerial shot of a roundabout in Germany that has a pedestrian bicycle underpass at a multi-lane approach, and then also a distal or removed crosswalk in a curve to generate slow vehicular speed, but away from the multi-lane crossing at the 2-lane entry. What I've shown here is a link to our website. There's a lot of additional information if anyone is interested, especially if you go to the link and click on the Publications and Presentations link, and we'd also be happy to follow up with anyone, either in this webinar or then afterwards with any further questions. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Bastian. That was a great presentation. We're gonna take a quick break here, and we're gonna turn it over to Hillary in just a second. But first, I actually have one more poll that I wanted to see if you all could help us weigh in on, and this is directly related to some of the information that Bastian just presented about some treatments that are often used in conjunction with roundabouts. And so we're interested to know, for those of you who have constructed roundabouts, what types of treatments, have you used in conjunction with your roundabouts? We're interested to find out if a lot of you are using the hybrid beacons or hawks, rapid flashing beacons, raised crosswalks, or others. That other category could be a lot of things. So if you answered other, why don't you go ahead also and submit that treatment to us in the question pod. I'd be interested to see how those look, and maybe at the end we can know some of those and talk about them as well. Maybe ask the presenters how they can be better handled or better incorporated into roundabouts. So we'll give you a few more minutes to respond to these. Again, check as many of them as are relevant to you, and then we can get started with Hillary in just a second. And just another note, we got a lot of questions, and I apologize I didn't mention this earlier. We will be archiving all of the webinar materials, including the slides, on our website, and we will also be, within a week or two, we'll be posting a video of the archive presentation with all the audio and everything like that too. So we'll all have that available after the fact, and when you receive your email, your automatic email in the next couple of days, that'll include a link to the page where all the materials can be found. So don't feel like you have to take too many diligent notes during the webinar. We'll have all those slides posted for you. So, well, thank you all for responding to the poll. I'm going to close it now, and I'm going to turn it over to Hillary to conclude our presentation. So, Hillary, go ahead and take it over whenever you like, and take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Can you hear me?
You can speak up just a little bit. That would be good, but I can hear you.
Okay, sure. I'll
Great,
do my
perfect.
best here. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. And so I'm going to share with you some slides specifically looking at safety considerations with roundabouts, and it does go hand in hand with what Bastian just covered in terms of accessibility. But just going to highlight a little bit further some of the safety features that go along with roundabouts. And again, Bastian did cover some of this, but I think it's important to kind of just step back and look at the various aspects of the roundabout and tie the design characteristics directly to safety. So with that, I will head through the slides here. So as we, again, as we go through this, we're going to hopefully, if you're not familiar already with some of the roundabout features, you'll be able to identify those in terms of safety, and then just looking at some of the safety benefits that are for pedestrians, but not only for motor vehicles at intersections and specifically at roundabouts. And then I just want to highlight a little bit more some of the FHWA initiatives supporting roundabout implementation in terms of safety. Tamara already highlighted our the proven safety countermeasures, many of those relating directly to pedestrians, and many of them actually overlapping as well. And roundabouts is one of those that actually ties very nicely together with some of the other proven countermeasures that I'll cover in just a bit with some of the examples that I will be showing. So again, just want to make it clear in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about a modern roundabout. Bastian showed you a couple of slides of a large rotary or a neighborhood traffic calming circle. This is the example of a typical single-lane roundabout that you would see. It's got slow entry into the roundabout. Typically, we're seeing 15 to 25 miles an hour as a vehicle driving through a roundabout. You can see in this particular photo there's a truck apron. You've got the sidewalks. The crosswalks are typically set back about 1 car length, 20 feet behind the yield line. You can see that there on all of the approaches. And then again, the separation from the circulatory roadway to the sidewalk, and that again assists with wayfinding as well as gives a comfort level to that pedestrian as they're walking near an intersection and along the roadway. Okay. So again, the main components that are contributing to the safety for pedestrians at a roundabout are slower speeds for all motorists. Now, this not only introduces safety for pedestrians, but it introduces the safety of the motor vehicles that are driving through that intersection as well. All vehicles are traveling, again, at speeds 15 to 25 miles an hour, typically the average speeds that you're seeing at roundabouts. And so that really creates a different environment that we see than what we see at traditional intersections, whether it might be a two-way stop control intersection or a signalized intersection. So those slower speeds are key. In the next couple of slides, I am going to show you why speed makes such a difference. The shorter crossing distances are often associated with the approaches of roundabouts, and that basically what that's doing is it's reducing the exposure in terms of the distance that a pedestrian needs to cross at an intersection, as well as the time. Obviously, the distance and time are related in terms of someone crossing that particular approach or that particular intersection. There's a reduction in conflict points. So I'm going to show a diagram here in a couple of minutes that really illustrates the difference in the number of conflict points that exist at an intersection, not only with vehicles and the vehicles, but the vehicles and the pedestrians. And those conflict points, anytime we can reduce conflict points, we have an opportunity, hopefully, to improve safety and for everyone that might be involved at an intersection, all the users that are involved at an intersection. In addition to that shorter crossing that I talked about, there's also at a roundabout, pedestrians are crossing one direction of travel at a time. There is refuge in that splitter island in the photo you can see there. There's a couple of moms with their kids. The kids are walking their bikes across the street, and they're crossing the one direction. They'll take pause if necessary in the splitter island, and then they will cross the other direction. That splitter island really does facilitate an area for pedestrians to take refuge as they cross that particular approach. Going back to speed, the reason why speed is so important and speed makes a huge difference at intersections is that speed can affect whether or not you're able to avoid a crash or not. And now we're talking about the driver here. But you can see there, it really is just a matter of some physics in terms of calculating what your speed is and then how long it would take a driver to actually, going a certain speed, come to a complete stop for a pedestrian or whatever it might be. But higher speeds equate to greater reaction and stopping sight distance. And so you can see there that at those lower speeds, there's much more of an opportunity for that driver. No matter how good of a driver you are, you do have to get from whatever speed you're going to zero if you're trying to stop for a pedestrian or avoid a crash of some sort. So speed is critical. Also, if you look at the way that speed affects crash severity, you can see here that, again, at the lower speeds here on the top is 20 miles per hour. The chance of a death of a pedestrian hit by a motor vehicle is about 5%. If you are driving 50 miles an hour, it's almost pretty much certain that if you are a pedestrian and you are hit by a vehicle, that you will be killed. And as you all know, even on roadways that might be posted 35 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour headed into an intersection, we oftentimes see speeds that are much higher. And so by introducing a roundabout into that intersection, you've, again, changed that driving environment. All vehicles have to slow to those speeds that are between the 15 and 25 miles an hour, again, on an average. And so the roundabout has created an environment where all vehicles are traveling at slower speeds. And pedestrians, that's a better environment for pedestrians, for bicyclists, and for motor vehicles. I just want to highlight again with this photo, we saw this previously, in terms of the shorter crossing distances as well as the crossing one direction of travel at a time. Now, you can see here, now imagine this. So this is a roundabout here. We're looking at a roundabout photo. But now imagine this as a two-way stop-controlled intersection or a signalized intersection. And immediately what I hope some of you are thinking is, oh, well, then we probably have for sure a left turn lane or a right turn lane. So now visualize the left turn lane and the right turn lane and that additional crossing distance that that pedestrian has to cross. And with a roundabout, you really do minimize that because the beauty of the roundabout is you don't need those left and right turn lanes because you're facilitating those through the circulatory roadway. And with the yield on entry, vehicles, basically it's self-regulating in terms of the vehicle deciding when to enter the circulatory roadway. So this example hopefully illustrates the fact that those distances are shorter and the splitter islands facilitate crossing one direction and really having the pedestrian concentrate on one direction of travel at a time. Here again is those conflict points that I mentioned. You can see here that for the pedestrian there's 16 conflict points. This is vehicle pedestrian conflict points, and this is at what you would have at one direction or one lane in each direction on each of those approaches. Obviously, the more lanes you add, the more conflict points there would be. But in this case, you can see we're comparing apples to apples in terms of conflict points, one lane in each direction. And you've got 16 for vehicle pedestrian at a traditional intersection and 8 conflict points at a roundabout. Again, this is looking at a single lane roundabout. So anytime we can reduce conflicts, again, the chances are that we have hopefully increased safety. And you combine that with decreasing conflict points, decreasing speeds, decreasing crossing distance for those pedestrians, you can see that you've got a very safe environment, or creating a safe environment. We're not able to prevent everything from happening, but because of the environment that we've created, hopefully it is safe for all users. Some of the pedestrian crash data that we do have, again, unfortunately, this is limited with what we have in terms of pedestrian data, and I speak generally there in terms of what we have for pedestrian data. Some cities and counties and even states are very, very good at their pedestrian data, and that tends to be in more very urbanized areas. But in terms of even looking at crash data at roundabouts, the data that we do have available comes from the NCHRP 572 report, which was roundabouts in the United States, where they, with the 39 roundabouts that they looked at for crash data that had pedestrians, there was 139 legs, 39 roundabouts. There was 5 reported crashes over an average crash history of 3.8 years. So again, not a whole lot of data that we had, and that was published in 2007. So that was data probably that was available prior to 2004. In terms of international data, you can see there I listed a couple of other countries, the United Kingdom, as well as a Dutch study that was done that are showing some reductions in pedestrian crashes as well as total injury crashes. You can see the UK numbers, 0.33 crashes per million trips at roundabouts versus 0.67 crashes per million trips at signals. So I think these numbers will get better for the U.S., but again, we aren't seeing a whole lot of crash data right now in terms of pedestrians, and we're hopeful that the reason there isn't that much crash data because there's nothing to report, but at the same time we want to make sure that that's being captured. And the study, the FHWA study that Bastian mentioned, it also does have a task that's looking at severe and fatal crashes and trying to get a better understanding of crashes that are occurring at roundabouts. And so hopefully in 2 years' time we'll have more information to share, and hopefully prior to that. Good design is important not only for safety, but it's also important in terms of operations. And the location of the crosswalks should be looked at carefully in terms of where they're placed. What are the origins and destinations of your pedestrians in that area? Do they make sense in terms of where the crosswalks are and where that crosswalk is in relationship to the yield line? The photos that I'm showing there are actually from when the Golden, Colorado roundabout was under research with the raised crosswalk on the bottom left and the pedestrian hybrid beacon there in the top right. You can get the perspectives in terms of, as a driver, the picture on the right is in the circulatory roadway. Is that crosswalk and is that beacon, in this case, visible to the driver? Same goes for that raised crosswalk. Is that crosswalk visible to the driver in terms of being able to see the pedestrian and be able to slow down? What are their speeds at that particular position that they would be able to stop if need be? So the visibility of the crosswalks, the location of the crosswalks, the slight distance as that driver is approaching a crosswalk. So it doesn't just apply to roundabouts. It's a little bit different when we talk about roundabouts, but it's very similar to a lot of things that we're talking about with design in general. So it's thinking about the pedestrians, where they're going, where they're coming from, and can we see them as drivers, and is the driver able to recognize and react in an appropriate amount of time to allow a safe crossing. Some of the design techniques within the NCHRP 672, which is the Roundabouts Informational Guide, the second edition that replaces that FHWA 2000 version. Sidewalks should be set back from the edge of the circulatory roadway. as we've seen in several photos. The recommended sidewalk width is 6 feet, but of course, if you've got a lot of pedestrians or if you're sharing with bicyclists, you want to reconsider that and have a little bit wider, and 10 feet at a minimum, I would say, with the sidewalk. A typical and minimum crosswalk setback, again, at 20 feet or about 1 car length behind the yield line. Again, you want to look at your situation. Bastian showed an example of the zigzag. Obviously, if you've got a zigzag, it might be 20 feet setback from the yield line on the approach, but on the exit, it might be shifted back just a little bit further. So you want to be thinking about that with your design. Raised crosswalks can encourage slow vehicle speeds where pedestrians cross. Again, I think Bastian mentioned this. A raised crosswalk obviously changes what a vehicle, or should change how a vehicle is driving through that approach area, because they physically are going to have to go up and over the raised crosswalk. Nowadays, we're seeing a lot of really good designs of raised crosswalks that aren't abrupt for any of the types of vehicles. Even, we also want to be thinking about our emergency vehicles and things of that nature. But there's a lot of good designs I've seen out there now that are really cognizant of having a good, smooth driving surface, but as well as identifying a pedestrian crossing and having some visibility for those pedestrians. I'm going to go through a couple of examples here, and some of you, I'm sure, have probably seen some of these photos before, but I think they're really good in terms of before and after, and what you can see a corridor looks like before and what it looks like after. Again, put yourself in the situation. Say you're walking down this street, and there is a signal at that particular intersection in this photo, and imagine yourself crossing all of those lanes. You've got the right turn lane, you've got 2 through lanes, you've got a left turn lane, and then you've got 2 lanes coming from the other direction there. So you're crossing 6 lanes. And when you talk about signal timing, that actually also increases additional time sometimes in your signal timing phases when you're having to account for pedestrians, as we should be accounting for the pedestrians crossing at that particular location. So now they looked at that corridor. That was a project that they did. And in this case, it now looks like this, okay? This is before and this is after with the roundabout. So obviously, we even got rid of a lane there. So what that tells me is they probably didn't need that additional through lane for capacity reasons. They only needed the single lane. And oftentimes, we need the capacity at the intersections. We don't need it in the segment areas. So that environment completely changed for those pedestrians and even the bicyclists in that area and the drivers. It's more conducive to slower driving. You've changed the environment. There's narrower lanes. And the pedestrians have basically a 12-foot piece of pavement to cross versus the 6 lane, versus the and the 1 approach versus the 4 lanes and then the 2 lanes on the other side versus the 1. So you can see how that corridor was completely transformed. And not only did it create a different environment for that pedestrian, but for that bicyclist and for that user. And this is a really good example of some of the proven safety countermeasures that Federal Highways is really trying to encourage agencies to implement. Here we've got an example of a road diet where we've gone from 4 through lanes to 2 through lanes, 1 in each direction. We've got a roundabout at this particular location. We also have a median, okay? So median is one of those proven safety countermeasures. And so it's a combination of 3 of the proven safety countermeasures on that corridor. So there's one example. Here it is actually looking at it from above a Google Earth image. You can see there the roundabout we're talking about is there on the left side. So I share this picture with you because you can see the difference between the roundabout on the left and the signalized intersection on the right, where you've got multiple left turn lanes, and you've got your through lanes, and then you've got a right lane, and you've got a bike lane. So there's the difference between 2 different intersections that are very close to each other and 2 completely different designs. And think of yourself as a pedestrian crossing both of those intersections and what experience you might have and what's your safety comfort level on each of those. Another example in terms of pedestrians and safety is from Howard, Wisconsin, which is in Brown County, Wisconsin. They actually, I know the image is pretty small there, folks, but you can see, I think, on the upper part of that image is a couple of school campuses. They've got an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school. This is an area that was growing, it was developing, so it used to have more of a rural cross-section, but now has more of a suburban or urban cross-section. They put in roundabouts, if you folks can see it, towards the west end of that image, and then there's a couple in the middle. There's 4 now, 2 in the middle, and then 1 towards the east side or the right side of that image. And again, this is a school campus. You've got kids biking, walking, and parents dropping off, and you've got the school buses. And I give you a little excerpt from the school newspaper that basically talks about how prior to those roundabouts going in at that location, students were not allowed to ride their bicycles to school. It was not allowed because the law enforcement was so concerned about the safety of those students. And after the roundabouts went in, students were encouraged to ride their bicycles and walk more. They do have a crossing guard right in front of the school there to help kids across the intersection, especially during the peak hours, obviously. But again, you can see those roundabouts change that environment of that corridor for those students that were walking and biking, and again, even the drivers. Another example that you may have heard about, this is another one on the upper left, the before, is the cross-section that we oftentimes see in our suburban areas. In this case, they've got 4 roundabouts. This is the Golden Road corridor that I showed a couple of pictures of, and this is actually also where Bastian had done some of that research for the 674 project. Again, you've really changed the driving experience for the driver. You've also changed that experience for that pedestrian, which was very positive. There was a paper that was written by LSD, Alex Arnello, that highlighted the before and after in terms of what happened on this corridor in Golden Road. Before, they were seeing 85th percentile speeds of 47 miles an hour. After the roundabouts were put in, it was 35 miles an hour. Yet the interesting thing was the travel time on the corridor was less with the roundabouts. Even though the speed was less, the travel time was also less. In terms of crashes, again, saw a significant reduction in the number of total crashes as well as injury crashes. You can see there the numbers. And there was this is a transit corridor as well as a lot of businesses and pedestrians along here. This is another example of something that's a little bit extreme in terms of the roundabouts and how they can handle pedestrians. This is right next to or outside of Ranger Stadium in Arlington, Texas. And they constructed a roundabout there, and they do during the events. It's my understanding that they do have law enforcement that help people. The parking lots are more to the to the left side of this photo, and then the stadium is on the right. But again, you can see a good implementation. They do restrict where pedestrians are able to cross there, but it is a location. They looked at origin and destination. You can see how that crosswalk was actually shifted a little bit further to the south because that's the entrance into the stadium. So again, knowing what people are doing, knowing what the pedestrians are doing, and creating an environment for them, for it to be a positive and a safe environment for everyone. Again, I'm going to go back to some of the efforts within Federal Highway Administration in supporting the implementation of roundabouts because of the safety benefits that are associated with roundabouts. Again, you can see here are the 9, the 2012 proven safety countermeasures. Those related to pedestrian safety, again, roundabouts, the road diets you can see in that example from not only Golden, Colorado, but also from Asheville, North Carolina. You've got the median and pedestrian crossing islands, and then also the pedestrian hybrid beacon as we've seen, we've got a few examples of pedestrian hybrid beacons that have been installed near roundabouts. And I do envision that there will be more in the future, as well as other implementations. In terms of how you might be able to get more information about roundabout education, education is a key component to not only internally in terms of our staff, in terms of our council members, in terms of our mayor, in terms of if you're an engineer, the planners, or if you're a planner, the engineers. Federal Highways has a new roundabout outreach and education toolbox that can help you communicate. It's got case studies. We're building on this. We're growing this toolbox, but there are multiple case studies of what jurisdictions have done in terms of reaching out internally and externally with roundabout education. And there's some really good pedestrian examples in this toolbox. The other program that Federal Highways has is our peer-to-peer program, Roundabout peer-to-peer program. Federal Highways Office of Safety has multiple peer-to-peer programs. Roundabouts just happens to be one of them, where we're, and part of it is it's a first come, first serve. You can put in a request, and what we try to do is match your request with the peer experts that we have on the Roundabout peer-to-peer team. I happen to be one of them, but we do also have outside folks from state DOTs, from local agencies, from consultants that are helping us facilitate this peer-to-peer program. It's proven to be pretty successful, so if you're at all interested in terms of maybe implementing a roundabout and how you might address concerns that there might be with pedestrians, that's a good program. I want to show here quickly that the website or the email address is actually an email address, roundabout peer-to-peer at dot.gov, and then the website for the peer-to-peer program for Federal Highway Administration. And then last but not least, again, the current research that just got basically started last fall with Federal Highways, where we are looking at the effectiveness of rectangular rapid flash beacons at multi-lane pedestrian crossings, and that's the project that Bastian we'll be working on with many others. Specifically, I've already identified some locations in the Pacific Northwest, but again, we are also looking for other locations across the country of agencies that might be interested in installing a rectangular rapid flash beacon, or maybe already have installed a rectangular rapid flash beacon at a multi-lane roundabout, and the study team and the research team would be available to come in and do some data collection and include that in this particular research. You can see also with that research, there's some additional other tasks for your information. Okay, so last but not least, before we get into some questions and answers here, hopefully you're able to identify some of the roundabout features, the circulatory roadway, the reduction in the reducing the left turn lanes are the roundabout features that contribute to safety. And then in terms of pedestrians, we need to think about the reduced speeds, the shorter crossing distances, the reduced conflict points, as well as the crossing only one direction of travel at a time. And then last but not least, roundabouts is one of the 9 proven safety countermeasures that Federal Highways is supporting initiatives for implementation. And if you've got any more questions about that, you can contact me. There's my contact information. And I appreciate your attention. And now, for the good part, we get to get into the Q&A. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you very much, Hillary, for your presentation. We now have it looks like about 30 minutes for Q&A. And I've got a lot of questions that came into the chat pod. So if I didn't get to your question, hopefully we'll be able to circulate these after the webinar, so our panelists can help maybe respond to some of those. But I'll get to as many as I can right now. And Bastian and Hillary, I'll just pose them both to you all, and whoever would like to answer, if you both like to answer, that's fine.
Sounds good.
In terms of trends with roundabouts construction, just generally, does it seem to you all like it's more and more common for communities to be constructing roundabouts in the past several years, as opposed to maybe the period before that? And if so, or if not, what are the major barriers that you all see as reasons why communities are hesitant to install roundabouts?
Maybe I'll get started, and then Hillary might have some FSOA perspective. I've seen some numbers on the construction of roundabouts in the U.S., and they have rapidly accelerated. And I think there's a semi-official database that's maintained by Kittles and Associates that I think has on the order of 2,500 or more kind of certified roundabouts in the U.S., and that's quite an increase from just a few years ago. I think we've seen in the responses here of what some of the impediments are. I think the accessibility question for multi-lane roundabouts does have a lot of people concerned, a lot of agencies concerned in terms of the additional cost and requirements of signalization. So I think there are a lot of people looking for some answers in that area. But in general, I think a lot of roundabouts are being built, a lot of single-lane roundabouts, but also a fair number of multi-laners.
And yes, I will add to that, and I agree with Bastian's comments. And I also just want to give you some examples of, I believe that you know, sometimes it takes it's a slow start, but then you'll have an agency that has success and they just keep going. Wisconsin DOT is probably a really good example. They're one of the leaders in terms of implementation of roundabouts, and the rate that they've, in terms of the numbers that they have constructed over the years, has increased significantly. They have one project in particular, US 41, where they're going to be looking at constructing almost 44 roundabouts on a corridor. And so, again, you can see that how you get those roundabouts on the ground in terms of operations and safety. They are proving that they're beneficial to the roadway network, and then people want them more. You find you actually end up with community members that are asking for them. You have people that are asking you not to build them as well. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's important to know that some agencies really just have embraced them, and they are something. It's not, a roundabout isn't the exception to the rule anymore. It becomes more of the norm. I think one of the biggest barriers is education, and making sure that people understand the difference between a neighborhood traffic calming circle and a modern roundabout, and the benefits of a modern roundabout maybe over a traffic calming circle, and where might be appropriate places for each of those. I think the other piece of it is oftentimes there might not be a champion within an agency that's willing to you know, take the heat. And if something, you know, anytime you do something that you haven't done before, you have to do your homework, you have to educate, and you have to be willing to, you know, like I said, answer those questions and those calls that come in both before implementation as well as during and then after. And so I think that most of the places that have been successful with roundabouts thus far have been the agencies that have had champions within their organization or even outside the organization that have helped them come to the conclusion that roundabouts should be something that they should be considering for the roadway network.
Oh, great, thank you. Going off of that same point, you mentioned education is very important in terms of you know, having community help them become familiar with roundabouts. Are there specific things that you all can recommend communities can do to educate their citizens about new roundabouts, simply because people have somewhat cited that driver familiarity with, unfamiliarity with roundabouts rather, as one of the reasons they may not be installing them. So are there specific steps that a community can take prior to installing these to help bring the community up to speed on exactly how they're used and how they can be used effectively and safely?
I think the key there is, again, early and often. If you've never had a roundabout in your community before and you've got one on the table in terms of potentially it being an alternative at an intersection, working with the community members early, bringing them in with public meetings and brochures, websites to help them understand your particular location, and just communicating. Communication is important both internally and externally. And I think that is the key. And waiting until the final design plans before you're talking with the public. I think those of us that have been in this profession a long time know that that's usually not the way to go. It's thinking about this during the planning stages and engaging the public and taking them along the journey that you're going to take with implementing the first roundabout in your community. In some cases, they've had what they call roundabout rodeos, where they actually have laid the roundabout out in a parking lot with cones, and they've had people drive through your fire trucks. Maybe you've got a trucking route. You can just have citizens just drive through that roundabout with the cones. I've seen other examples where they've put tape down in a school gymnasium and had people walk through a mock-up of a roundabout. There's lots of different ways to do it, but I think the key is to do it early and know that this is something new and know that it might take a little bit extra effort. But the extra effort early on is more often than not is going to be a better thing as you get closer to construction and opening up that roundabout and the future of roundabouts in your community.
And I would maybe add to that that while the roundabouts may be new in a particular community, they're certainly not new anymore in the U.S. And there are a lot of really good examples, success stories, some of the research that Hillary mentioned with the FHWA roundabout guide, there's a lot of material there. FHWA's Office of Safety has a lot of resources on their website in terms of PowerPoint presentations. Their brochures are available that can be shipped to people interested, and just general on websites. There are a lot of from YouTube videos to pamphlets, a lot of agencies that have been very creative and very thorough in education materials on how to work with the roundabout, and it probably is not too difficult to find somebody who's willing to come and also speak to an audience and share some of their own experiences. And I think that's sometimes really helpful to hear from somebody who was faced with maybe some opposition to roundabouts, and then what happened after the implementation, because there are very few examples where the initial opposition, which is quite frequent, but very few examples where that initial opposition didn't go away after the roundabout was finally in place. In general, I think predominantly, overwhelmingly, the experience has been very positive.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the issue of accessibility at roundabouts. Both of you mentioned a lot of information about accessibility for individuals with visual impairments, or individuals with low vision, blind pedestrians. Can you expand a little more and talk about how roundabouts can accommodate individuals with other types of disabilities, such as hearing impairments, or older pedestrians, other individuals who may need to cross more slowly, getting beyond the visual impairments for a moment? How can you all talk about the accommodations for those types of disabilities at roundabouts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. From the perspective of the U.S. Access Board, I should emphasize that what I presented was a very condensed version of the guidelines, and there's a lot of information in there on tabling of intersections, of cross slopes for ramps, and so forth. So to have some requirements also for wheelchair users, and those apply to all intersections. So I didn't focus much here, but they should definitely be a consideration. But I think the other point is really important too. There's not necessarily as much research, but there is some amount of research that has been done with low vision pedestrians, so not people who are fully blind, but just have partial vision loss, various types of low vision, and there's certainly some difficulties in judging gaps, especially. And there's also research that shows that, for example, children have a very difficult time judging gaps, or time to arrival or time to contact of vehicles at a crossing point. So some of these issues haven't been studied quite as much, but I think the points that Hillary made are very important, because the low speed design and also the facilitating the decision-making process. The decisions have to be made at least unsignalized crossings, and having the ability at a roundabout to focus on one direction at a time, and then also have a relatively short crossing distance in a relatively low-speed environment should be quite beneficial. And that said, some of the treatments that I talked about in terms of the pedestrian hybrid beacon are expected to have similar benefits to other special pedestrian populations in terms of stopping motorized traffic, and then providing some crossing opportunities.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bastian. I appreciate the response to that. We're going to turn and maybe talk about a few more technical issues now. One of those is we had a question about on the splitter islands, and several of the images that were shown, some of the splitter islands were equipped with truncated domes where the pedestrians were crossing, and some were not. What is the guidance on providing truncated domes at the crossings at splitter islands specifically?
They are supposed to be there, and I tried to go back to some of those images and highlight the ones that were not outfitted. But in general, the detectable warnings or the truncated domes should be at any sidewalk edge, if you will. So anytime you transition from the sidewalk environment to the street environment, there should be detectable warnings provided, and preferably the splitter island and the refuge island should be wide enough to actually have two separate detectable warning surfaces, so that when somebody, for example, crosses the entry leg, that they have a detectable warning surface that tells them you are now out of the crossing, and then there's a bit of clear pavement or sidewalk, and then another set of detectable warnings that then alert the pedestrian that you are now crossing another roadway, in this case the exit lane. So each approach to the roundabout should have 4 sets of detectable warnings, 2 curb and 2 splitter island locations, both at the entry and the exit.
Great, thank you, Bastian. Oh, go ahead. Sorry,
I'll
Hillary.
just add to that, Dan. I was just going to say, as a function of that, that is very important in terms of your design to make sure that you do have wherever your crossing is going to be, your pedestrian crossing, that your splitter island is wide enough at that point to make sure that you can accommodate for the truncated domes, and that's where usually that minimum distance or that minimum criteria comes in for that splitter island at the location of the crosswalk. So you want to be conscious of that as you're tapering your splitter island back towards the approach, that you are able to get the truncated domes as Bastian just described. So that is one of those spots that you have to be careful of, because sometimes people tend to, when they're designed, they squeeze it too tight, and then you really don't get that refuge at that location.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Thanks for that point. This also relates to crossings at roundabouts. Specifically, you mentioned requiring the crosswalk markings set back from the roundabout itself. We had a couple of questions about whether it's also necessary to provide advanced yield lines in advance of those crosswalks at the approaches or departures. Could you talk a little bit about that?
You know, you typically don't see the advanced yield lines to the crosswalk. However, I don't know, Bastian, if you're able to speak to some of the observations in terms of the newer treatments that we're seeing in terms of the pedestrian hyper beacon, rectangular rapid flash beacon, and the preference of where those vehicles would be stopping at those types of treatments other than just the crosswalk. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's an important point. We've been asked before in presenting these results that how in the world did a race crosswalk that doesn't have any auditory information for the pedestrian, how did that help somebody who's blind make crossing decisions? And the best explanation that we've been able to come up with is that there's was a notable shift in driver behavior in terms of where they stopped relative to the crosswalk, and also how they stopped, or how rapidly they stopped. And if in the before condition, there seemed to be a lot of drivers who had a slow rolling yield and waited at quite a distance away from the crosswalk, which then made it very difficult to distinguish in an audible fashion what that person was doing. With the race crosswalk driver behavior, it seemed to shift much more to behavior at a signal, where drivers would drive up relatively fast at 20, 25 miles an hour and then come to a rapid stop right at the crosswalk, right before the vertical elevation, which appeared to be a lot easier to detect by hearing. And so certainly this is an anecdotal observation that's a little bit difficult to generalize without some more fundamental human factors research. However, I do think it points to maybe a disadvantage of using advanced yield markings from an accessibility perspective, and this would certainly require more research, but we were quite satisfied with the results at the race crosswalk, with drivers coming to a rapid and full stop in the proximity of the crosswalk, which seemed to be easier to hear than a slow rolling yield at some distance away.
Okay, great. Thank you both for that. I want to shift gears a bit and talk about accommodating cyclists at roundabouts. It's not the exact topic of the conversation today, but we have had a lot of questions about some of the different ways that communities are also addressing the needs of bicyclists. So we saw some examples of underpasses, and we're getting a few more questions about other ways that a community can handle, maybe if they have a bike lane approaching a roundabout. What are some of the different strategies that a community can use to accommodate bicyclists at roundabouts?
I'll start with that one. And in terms of, again, if we start talking about we need to talk about the level of expertise of the bicyclists, because there's your advanced bicyclists, maybe your road bikers. I'll call them road bikers that are comfortable with riding on the road. Then you've got your average bicyclist, which I consider myself in that category. And then you've got maybe the parents or grandparents with the kids. You've got the younger generation, and maybe some people that just aren't as comfortable maybe riding riding on a particular roadway. So in terms of that, in terms of roundabouts, you know, I showed a couple examples of roundabouts that actually did have the bike lane on the approaches leading up to it. Typically with single-lane roundabouts, you know, you might see that biker basically takes the lane and negotiate the roundabout just as a vehicle would. Again, if you think about the speeds of the vehicles, the bicyclist is pretty much going the same speed as the vehicles at that point in time. There's also within the NCHRP 672, which is the roundabout guidelines, partnership between Federal Highways and the Transportation Research Board at this time. There is actual guidance in there that shares how to do a bike ramp. So if that bike lane is leading up to the intersection, a person's not comfortable entering into the vehicle lane and traveling through the roundabout, they could take the bike ramp off that then would connect with the sidewalk, and then that pedestrian, or excuse me, then that bicyclist would either, depending on the state or jurisdiction's laws, dismount their bike and walk their bike through the crosswalk as a pedestrian, or in the case of some places, bicyclists are allowed to ride their bikes on the sidewalk. Now, if that was the case and you knew you were going to have bikers, if you remember what I said, if you know you're going to have bikes and pedestrians on that sidewalk, make sure it's wide enough for the bicyclists and the pedestrians, especially if the bicyclists are allowed to stay on their bicycles as they're negotiating across through the intersection and around the intersection. So the options are to take the lane like a vehicle. Some people have a comfort level with that, some don't. Or, like I said, there's design guidelines for introducing a bike ramp. That's typically, I believe that we recommend about 100 feet prior to the yield line to remove that bike lane, and then you take the people to the sidewalk and have them cross. And there's additional information, but I'll just highlight those couple points there in terms of the bicyclists. We do terminate the bicycle lane prior to the roundabout. So that bicyclist needs to make the decision either to take the lane or to use the bike ramp and use the sidewalk like a pedestrian.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hillary, very much. We have a question now related to a set of questions related to using raised crosswalks specifically. A lot of our attendees have noted that they have received some pushback using raised crosswalks in these instances, specifically hearing that it's not possible or less than desirable when there's a lot of truck traffic that may be coming through, and also maintenance concerns, especially in cold weather climates where roads are continuously paved. How can some communities address those concerns and then maybe counter with some of the benefits of using these raised crosswalks specifically at roundabouts? I'd be interested to hear what you both think about that.
Okay, maybe I'll get started, and then if Hillary has something to add, I'll know with her. I can certainly appreciate that comment, and in fact, there's quite a few states who actually have some state mandates against the use of obstacles, which includes the raised crosswalk in state-maintained roadways. In terms of trying to overcome some of these issues, all I can say is that there are quite a few states that have raised crosswalk at roundabouts, including Utah, including Colorado, not at roundabouts, but at other intersections with, for example, channelized turn lanes. In Boulder, Colorado, there are quite a few of those. And these are certainly locations that see a good amount of snow. And while I'm certainly not an expert on snowplows and all the considerations, it appears that those states have been able to figure out a solution. Now, that said, I can certainly see the impediment and the pushback of a raised crosswalk in a higher speed, higher volume environment. But then the question is if that's really the right environment to have pedestrians there. And so I think, as with all cases, there are certain considerations of which treatment is appropriate in what cases. And I certainly am not advocating that the raised crosswalk is a one-size-fits-all treatment at all multi-lane roundabouts. It seemed to work quite well at the one in Golden, Colorado, even though it was a temporary installation, has since been removed. I should emphasize that. And there might be other, lower volume type environment where they really are a good treatment. And then for those other ones, maybe the pedestrian hybrid beacon is the better application. So maybe the last point I'd like to make is that a roundabout already has very slow design speed, which contributes to their safety performance, both for vehicles and also for pedestrians. So I think if you're going to install a raised crosswalk anywhere, the roundabout might be the area where they have the least impact, because speeds realistically should already be reduced, and in fact you might get additional safety benefits of slowing down those entering and exiting drivers. So this is more personal opinion and conjecture rather than based on any sort of data, but I think that that it's a treatment that I would like to see used more, especially in environments where you maybe don't have the high vehicular or truck volume.
Great point, Bastian. And the only thing I'm going to add is that I think it's important that, as with everything, and again we can relate a lot of this to other alternatives and countermeasures that we might be talking about when we talk about safety, is we always have competing needs when we're making decisions. So absolutely, snow maintenance, large trucks, RVs, our fire trucks, our buses, those are all users, and we also need to think about operations. We need to think about safety and speed. We need to think about accessibility. So we've got a list of competing needs. So I think our challenge and our job is to balance those competing needs the best we can. And if the goal of the reconstruction of a particular intersection is safety and accessibility, then I think what we need to do is maybe put the emphasis on the fact that the speeds are going to be slower with the roundabout and the raised crosswalk. And maybe what we need to do is absolutely our maintenance folks should always be engaged when we're talking about something new, plowing in general, plowing the roundabout in general. We need to have that conversation. And so just kind of getting all of your competing needs down on paper and talk about what are the priorities and what's the driver of the project, and then try to think of other ways that we can try to, how we can plow, or what might the operators have to do differently when they come across. First of all, they need to know where those raised crosswalks are and things of that nature. So I think it's just hopefully it's having a conversation about priorities and what's driving the project, and then looking at the project in a holistic fashion.
Okay, thank you all very much for that. And unfortunately, I think that's all the time we're going to have today for questions. But thank you all very much for submitting your questions. And for those of you who didn't get your questions answered, we'll be collecting these and circulating them among the panelists, and hopefully we can post some responses to those questions after the webinar. So be on the lookout for that automatic email, which will have the link that will come out in the next couple of days, the link to where you can find all the archived materials, Q&A, and those sorts of things. So I just want to say a few more words about the webinar today. Thank you again for all of you for attending. Once again, a recording and a transcript of today's program, or a recording and the slides archive, will be online in about a week at a link that will be sent to you in the next couple of days. So be on the lookout for that. The slides will be up there. It'll take us about another week to get the video up and live. And I want to remind everyone that a very brief survey is going to appear once the webinar is ended. We really appreciate you taking a moment to complete it and provide your feedback. And thank you again to all of our speakers, Dr. Bastian Schroeder, Dr. Hillary Isebrands, and Tamara Redmond of the Up to Safety for their time today. And thanks to all of you for attending today's pedestrian-focused webinar.